The air in Black Creek, Georgia, hung thick and heavy, a suffocating blanket woven from humidity and the lingering dust of a war 5 years past. It was the summer of 1870, and the promise of reconstruction felt like a cruel joke to most. For Elias, a man of 23 whose life had been violently carved by the very men the North claimed to have defeated, the only thing thicker than the air was the palpable, unspoken tension between the freedmen and the former planters. Elias lived with his mother, Sarah, a woman whose spirit had been bent but not broken by decades of servitude. Their cabin, a humble, weathered structure on the edge of the sprawling, half-abandoned Oak Haven plantation, offered little sanctuary. Tonight, the silence was louder than any noise. The wind barely stirred the Spanish moss dangling from the live oak trees, and the distant, rhythmic chirping of cicadas seemed to be counting down to something terrible. Elias was sitting by the meager light of a kerosene lamp, methodically sharpening a large hunting knife, not for game, but for a man. His jaw was set, his movements precise, a chilling calm preceding a storm. Sarah watched him from her rocking chair, her eyes reflecting the old oil lamp's glow, filled with a mixture of fear and resigned understanding. "Elias," she finally whispered, the sound a dry rustle in the quiet room. "You going out again?" It wasn't a question. "I am, Mama," he replied, not looking up. His voice was low, carrying the deep rumble of repressed anger. "It's been 5 years since the war ended, but that mark, it's still fresh." He referred to the ugly, jagged scar burned into his upper back, a brand shaped like a crude, deformed capital C. It was the permanent signature of Colonel Silas Caldwell, the former owner of Oak Haven, a man notorious for his cold cruelty and his unrepentant adherence to the old ways. Caldwell was still in Black Creek, not running, but simply reasserting his power through intimidation and economic stranglehold. The colonel was not a ghost or a beast, but a man, which made the hunt all the more terrifyingly real. Elias finally stood, the tall, lean shadow he cast stretching menacingly across the cabin wall. He wore old, dark trousers and a worn cotton shirt. "I heard he's taken to drinking heavily at the old Magnolia Inn again, bragging about his losses, complaining the world's turned upside down. When he's drunk, he gets careless." Sarah rose, her movements slow and deliberate, walking over to him. She placed a trembling hand on his arm, her grip surprisingly firm. "Elias, I know what he did. We both carry it. But vengeance, it's a cold path. It won't bring back what we lost. It'll only lose you. It's not just vengeance, Mama. It's closure. This town will never be free, we will never be safe, until Caldwell is gone or silenced. He runs this place like a secret king. He has the sheriff in his pocket and the local chapter of the clan. They breathe his orders." The mention of the clan made the air crackle. It was the unseen hand of terror that controlled Black Creek's nights. Elias's plan was risky, bordering on suicidal, but the brand on his back felt like a moral imperative. He had spent the last 5 years listening, gathering whispers, building a detailed mental map of Caldwell's routines, his allies, and his vulnerabilities. Tonight's target was simple reconnaissance, to observe Caldwell at the inn, to confirm the rumors of his excessive drinking, and to gauge the loyalty of the men surrounding him. He tucked the knife into his belt, pulling his shirt down to cover it. "Be careful, my son," Sarah pleaded, her eyes welling up. "If they catch you near him, they won't just run you off. They'll make an example of you." Elias leaned down and kissed his mother's forehead. "I've been an example since I was a boy, Mama. Tonight, I start writing a new chapter." He stepped out of the cabin and into the heavy, moonless night. The path to the Magnolia Inn was a mile of dirt road, winding past overgrown cotton fields and through the darkest stretches of the woods. The silence of the forest was oppressive, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the dry earth. As he walked, Elias felt the familiar hot ache of the brand on his back, a constant physical reminder of the hatred and injustice he was fighting. It was not a mystical scar. It was a real physical injury, a symbol of a real enduring evil. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus on the reality of the situation. Caldwell was a man, weakened by pride and alcohol, and therefore vulnerable. Elias wasn't hunting a monster but a fading tyrant, and that was a dangerous hunt indeed. Reaching the edge of Black Creek's small center, Elias took shelter in the thick shadows of a dilapidated general store across from the inn. The Magnolia Inn, a two-story wooden structure, was one of the few places in town that looked alive. A warm, yellow light spilled from its windows, and the sound of boisterous laughter and slurred voices drifted across the street. The heavy scent of cheap whiskey and pipe tobacco hung in the humid air. Elias narrowed his eyes, peering through a gap in the slats. He saw him immediately. Colonel Caldwell, a man in his late 50s, his face flushed and his uniform jacket open, holding court at a large table near the fire. Caldwell's eyes were bloodshot, his movements expansive and sloppy as he regaled his company, 3 younger, heavily built white men, clearly his loyal followers, with a loud, contemptuous story. Elias listened, his breath held tight in his chest. Caldwell was talking about keeping order and reminding the uppity ones of their place. The colonel's words were laced with casual threats, clear indicators that his reign of terror had not ended with the war. Suddenly, as Caldwell slammed his fist on the table in a drunken gesture, one of his companions, a man with a drooping mustache named Jed, caught sight of something outside. Jed's laughter stopped abruptly. Elias felt a sudden, icy jolt. Had he been seen? He pressed himself flat against the wood, listening, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Jed spoke, his voice carrying a note of suspicion. "Colonel, I think I just saw something move across the street by Old Man Peterson's store." Caldwell slurred a dismissal. "Nonsense, Jed. Probably just a stray dog. Another whiskey." But Jed was already standing up, his eyes fixed on the shadows where Elias hid. This was the first obstacle. Elias knew he had to retreat now before he compromised the entire operation. He backed away silently, praying the creak of the old wood wouldn't betray him. He was out of sight, but not out of mind. The encounter, brief as it was, had confirmed the danger and the colonel's vulnerability. The hunt was on. As Elias hurried back into the concealing darkness of the fields, a deeper sense of dread settled over him. Caldwell's guard was lower than expected, but his men were vigilant. The path to justice was a tightrope walk over an abyss of brutal consequence. Thank you for watching Chapter 1 of The Widow's Black Sun. The mystery and the hunt for the colonel have just begun. Don't miss how Elias navigates the dangerous streets of Black Creek and gets closer to his target. To ensure you catch the next chapter and the full story as it unfolds, please take a moment to hit the subscribe button below and turn on notifications. The following day brought a sweltering, oppressive heat that matched the psychological pressure mounting on Elias. He spent the morning working in the small garden plot behind their cabin, the sun beating down mercilessly, but his mind was far away, dissecting the events of the previous night. Jed, the sharp-eyed man at the inn, was a known enforcer for Caldwell, a man whose loyalty was bought with privilege and alcohol. Elias realized his initial plan, a swift, quiet confrontation, was too simplistic. Caldwell was a spider in a web, and touching one thread meant alerting the whole structure. Elias needed an ally, someone inside the town's fragile, unspoken power structure who wasn't under Caldwell's direct control. His thoughts turned to Martha, the cook at the Magnolia Inn. Martha was a quiet, formidable elderly black woman who had lived in Black Creek longer than anyone, working in kitchens since before the war. She saw everything and, more importantly, heard everything. Elias had a distant family connection to her, enough to warrant a cautious approach. The decision to involve someone else was a heavy one. Elias had always relied on his solitude and his own resolve. But the danger was too great to face alone. He knew the risk he was asking Martha to take. That afternoon, under the pretense of selling Sarah's freshly picked greens, Elias walked into town, his senses on high alert. The atmosphere in Black Creek was noticeably heavier today. The few white merchants he passed eyed him with suspicion, and the local sheriff, Thaddeus Jones, a bulky man with a permanent scowl, was leaning against the porch of his office watching the road. The sheriff was Caldwell's shadow, a clear obstacle. Elias reached the back entrance of the Magnolia Inn. The air here was thick with the smell of fried pork and stale beer. He found Martha sorting potatoes in the dimly lit, sweltering kitchen. "Aunt Martha," Elias said softly, his voice barely cutting through the clatter of pots. Martha jumped, dropping a potato. She turned, her dark eyes wide with fear, then narrowing with recognition. "Elias, what in God's name are you doing here? You know how the sheriff is these days." "I know. I need information, Aunt Martha. I need to know the colonel's schedule when he's not at the inn. Where does he go? Who does he meet with privately?" Elias leaned closer, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "It's about what he did. To me. To my father." Martha looked away, her face a mask of old, deep pain. "The man is evil, Elias. Everyone knows it, but you can't fight him. He's got eyes and ears in every corner, and tonight he's having a private meeting. Not here, at the lodge." The lodge. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The lodge was an old, dilapidated Masonic hall on the outskirts of town, known to be the unofficial meeting place for Caldwell and his most zealous followers, the clan chapter. It was a place where justice had no jurisdiction. "The lodge?" Elias pressed. "What kind of meeting?" Martha shook her head, nervously glancing at the kitchen door. "I just heard snippets, whiskey orders, new recruitment, and papers." He was asking the innkeeper for large, sturdy paper and ink. Said he needed to draw up documents of sale. "Documents of sale?" Elias repeated, a new dimension of the colonel's tyranny clicking into place. Caldwell wasn't just drinking away his sorrows. He was actively plotting. The documents of sale likely referred to illegal land grabs or the forced unfair re-signing of labor contracts with newly freed families, essentially re-enslaving them economically. Suddenly a heavy voice boomed from the doorway. "Martha, where's my water, and who is this boy bothering you?" It was the innkeeper, a corpulent man named Mr. Hayes, his face red and sweating. Elias straightened immediately, his face neutral. "Just delivering fresh greens for my mother, sir. She sent me." He held up a small basket of wilted collards. Hayes squinted at him, his gaze lingering suspiciously. "Well, get out, and tell your mother to deliver them earlier next time. This kitchen ain't for loitering." Elias nodded curtly, his heart hammering, and quickly retreated. The encounter was close, too close. He had his information. Caldwell was at the lodge tonight, dealing with documents of sale. The threat to the community was imminent, raising the stakes beyond his personal vengeance. Now he was not just hunting an enemy, he was pursuing a criminal conspiracy. Back at the cabin, Elias shared the news with Sarah. The fear in her eyes was now mixed with a renewed sense of purpose. "The lodge," Sarah murmured, her hands smoothing the wrinkles in her apron. "That's where the devil does his paperwork. You can't go in there, Elias. It's a trap." "I won't go in. I'll watch. I need to know what families he's targeting with those contracts. If I can prove he's intimidating people into signing, I can bring in the federal agents. That's the only law that can touch him here." Elias had been quietly corresponding with an agent in Atlanta named Agent Thomas, a man committed to the Reconstruction Acts. But he needed solid, tangible proof. He checked his knife again, ensuring the blade was sharp and the leather sheath secure. The psychological terror of knowing Caldwell was planning to legally entrap his neighbors fueled Elias's resolve. The colonel was not just branding backs. He was trying to brand the entire community's future. The suspense of waiting for nightfall, knowing the evil being plotted miles away, was a suffocating pressure that dwarfed the Georgia heat. The night arrived, darker and more silent than the last. Elias left the cabin, his shadow blending into the dense foliage. Tonight, the hunt would move from observation to confrontation with the evidence itself. The lodge stood a mile outside Black Creek, a skeletal silhouette against the faint glow of the distant town lights. It was a two-story building, once grand, now rotting, its windows mostly boarded up, giving it a blind, malevolent look. The air around it was stagnant, thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Elias approached with agonizing caution. He moved through the tall weeds and tangled vines, every snap of a twig sounding like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. He wore dark clothing and had rubbed mud on his hands and face to break up his outline. His sole purpose was to get close enough to witness the meeting and, crucially, to identify those documents of sale. 2 horses were tied haphazardly to an old hitching post near the front porch. The animals shifted restlessly, their snorts and the occasional clink of a bridle the only consistent sounds. A sliver of yellow light escaped from a crack in the warped window shutters on the ground floor. Elias circled to the back of the lodge. The rear wall was in worse shape, the foundation visibly crumbling. He managed to find a spot where the skirting boards had rotted away, allowing him to belly crawl toward a gap right beneath the window frame. The dirt was damp and cold against his skin, a sharp contrast to the day's heat. Pressing his ear against the wooden wall, Elias could hear muffled, heavy voices, Caldwell's distinctive, slurred baritone leading the conversation. The humidity had turned the building into a sounding box, and while the words were indistinct, the tone of cold, authoritarian menace was perfectly clear. Elias painstakingly widened the gap in the wood with the tip of his knife, careful not to make a sound. Finally, he had a narrow, dust-filled view into the room. The interior was rough, a few folding chairs, a kerosene lamp casting harsh shadows, and a large, rickety table covered in various papers. Colonel Caldwell sat at the head, looking less drunk than the previous night, his eyes clear but hard. Beside him sat Jed and the other 2 men from the inn, all 3 armed. Caldwell gestured with a cigar toward a stack of documents. "These, boys, are the new contracts, binding, legal, and ironclad. The law is on our side now, even if the Yankees think they've won. We are simply employing their labor according to the new mandates. These lands, they stay ours." Elias's gaze fixed on the papers. They were large, official-looking documents, clearly prepared with care. He could make out the top line on the nearest document. Agreement for indentured labor and land tenure. The psychological terror hit him. These weren't just land deals, they were carefully worded documents designed to exploit the newly freed, essentially locking them into a debt peonage system. Slavery by another name. "Tomorrow," Caldwell continued, exhaling a cloud of bitter smoke, "we start with the Williams family. Jed, you and Billy go first. Remind them gently of the money they owe for that mule and how this contract will clear their debt. Make sure they know they can't refuse." The Williams family. Elias knew them, hard-working, proud, and completely reliant on the small patch of land they had managed to lease. The colonel was starting with the most vulnerable. Just as Elias was mentally recording the specific details of the conspiracy, he heard a new, chilling sound, the click of a hammer being pulled back on a pistol. "We need a contingency, Colonel." One of the men, a younger, nervous fellow named Silas Jr., stammered. "What if they do refuse? Or what if that damned federal agent Thomas catches wind?" Caldwell chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "Agent Thomas is 50 miles away in Atlanta, worried about elections, not field hands. And as for refusal, Jed, remind the boy what happened to that wagon wheel last week." Jed grinned, a nasty, sharp expression. "We reminded him, Colonel. The refusal of a contract. It looks a lot like vandalism and property damage on their part, which requires punishment. A good scare goes a long way." The psychological tension in the small space under the floor was agonizing. Elias felt his muscles seize up, the air thick with the conspiracy being hatched above him. He had to get evidence of the documents and the targets. An idea flashed through his mind, desperate and dangerous. He pulled out a small, charred pencil stub and a scrap of paper he kept for market notes. Through the crack, he strained to copy the precise title of the document and the name of the first target family, the Williams family. The paper was flimsy, and the light meager, forcing him to rely on touch and quick glances. Suddenly, a loud thump shook the floor above him. Caldwell had stood up, pushing his chair back. "I need to stretch my legs," the colonel announced. "Jed, grab those contracts. We'll look them over on the porch. I need some air." Panic seized Elias. If they came out, they would walk right over the spot where he lay. He had to move now. He quickly tucked the scrap of paper into the sole of his boot, the most secure place he had. He began to pull himself backward, agonizingly slow, out from beneath the lodge. The damp earth made a soft, squelching sound that seemed to amplify 1,000 times. He was halfway out when he heard the porch door creak open above him. Caldwell's voice, now closer and sharper, cut through the night. "What was that? Did you hear that, Jed?" "Hear what, Colonel?" "That scraping sound. It came from under the porch. Go check the foundations, boy. I don't like stray creatures sneaking around my business." Jed's footsteps thudded heavily on the wooden porch, getting closer to the edge. Elias scrambled, heedless now of the noise, dragging himself out from under the lodge's shadow and into the tall weeds. He could hear Jed grunt as he dropped to his knees, peering beneath the porch. "Nothing, Colonel. Just rats, I reckon. It's an old place." Elias kept running, low to the ground, until he reached the safety of the deeper woods. His chest heaved, not just from the exertion, but from the raw terror of being cornered. He had his proof, flimsy as it was, and the name of the first victim. The stakes were no longer just Elias's vengeance. They were the fate of the Williams family, and potentially every other free black family in Black Creek. He was no longer just a hunter. He was a desperate protector, and the colonel's plot had just become a timed trap. Elias had to reach Agent Thomas, but first he had to warn the Williamses. Elias arrived back at the cabin just before dawn, exhausted, mud-caked, and trembling. Sarah was awake, stoking the embers of the hearth. One look at his face was enough for her. "The lodge?" she whispered, fear etched around her eyes. "Yes, it's worse than we thought, Mama. They're using legal papers, contracts, to force people back into servitude. The Williams family is the first target. They're planning to hit them this morning." Elias quickly recounted the conversation he overheard, showing her the small, charred scrap of paper bearing the document title and the family name. The reality of the colonel's plan, using the very framework of the law to perpetuate their oppression, was a chilling new layer of psychological terror. It wasn't just brute force. It was calculated, institutional evil. "We have to warn them," Sarah insisted, her fear transforming into determined action. "But you can't go near that farm in the light. Caldwell will be watching every road." "I know. I need to get to Atlanta. Agent Thomas is the only one who can stop this before Caldwell signs those papers with the sheriff as a witness. But I'll lose a day traveling, and the Williamses will be ruined by noon." A new, vital character entered the narrative. Sarah, wiping the dirt from Elias's face, looked him in the eye. "There is another way. Reverend John. He's discreet. He visits the Williamses every Tuesday to read scripture. He won't question you, but he will listen to me." Reverend John was an influential figure in the local black community, a man of quiet authority whose words carried weight. Involving him was a massive risk, but the alternative was immediate disaster. Elias recognized the wisdom of his mother's advice. She had navigated the subtle politics of the plantation for decades. Her judgment was sound. "Tell the Reverend exactly what I saw, Mama. Tell him to warn the Williamses, to disappear, not to sign anything, and to say they are visiting family in Macon if questioned. I'll ride to Atlanta, and I'll be back with Agent Thomas before Caldwell knows what happened." Elias quickly ate a meager meal and prepared his horse, an old but reliable mare named Bessie. He couldn't afford a moment's delay. The journey to Atlanta was long and dangerous, running the gauntlet of suspicion and open hostility from Caldwell's sympathizers along the route. "If I'm not back in 3 days, Mama," Elias said, his voice heavy with finality, "you go to Atlanta yourself. You find Agent Thomas, you tell him everything." Sarah embraced him, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of the impossible odds they faced. "You be careful, Elias. Don't let your anger outrun your mind." He rode out as the sun began its brutal ascent, following the back roads and winding creek beds, keeping to the woods whenever possible. The journey was a study in paranoia. Every sound, a snapping twig, a distant shout, the sight of a lone rider, sent a jolt of terror through him. The psychological pressure of knowing he held the key to his neighbor's freedom, and that Caldwell's men were likely already on the move, was a physical weight on his shoulders. Midday found Elias pushing Bessie hard. He stopped only to let her drink from a cool stream, his mind racing. He mentally reviewed every detail. The document title, the names of Caldwell's accomplices, the mention of the sheriff's involvement, the threat of property damage as a cover-up. He had to be coherent and convincing to Agent Thomas. The federal agent would need more than a former slave's desperate story. He would need facts. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep blues, Elias reached the outskirts of Atlanta. The city was a chaotic, bustling metropolis, a stark contrast to the sleepy, menacing silence of Black Creek. He felt momentarily lost in the crowds, a countryman swallowed by progress. He found the federal offices just as the lamps were being lit. The building was imposing, a symbol of the distant, often indifferent power of the Union. Elias, exhausted and covered in trail dust, was initially stopped by a stern-faced clerk. "I need to see Agent Thomas," Elias insisted, his voice raw. "It's a matter of life and death. A conspiracy against newly freed families in Black Creek." The name Black Creek and the mention of conspiracy finally caught the clerk's attention. He reluctantly led Elias to a back office. Agent Thomas was a tired, meticulous man in his early 40s, surrounded by stacks of paperwork, his desk lit by a single lamp. He looked up, his expression skeptical but professional. Elias, without preamble, launched into his story, starting with the brand on his back, the psychological starting point of his hunt, and moving quickly to the facts. The lodge, the contract title, the Williams family, Caldwell's men, and the involvement of Sheriff Jones. He placed the charred scrap of paper on the desk. Agent Thomas listened in silence, his expression hardening as the details unfolded. "Indentured labor and land tenure," he read aloud, tapping the scrap. "They're getting clever, using legal language to circumvent the 13th Amendment. They're not calling it slavery. They're calling it a loan default. They're moving this morning, Agent. They'll ruin the Williamses by tomorrow," Elias pleaded. "They'll use intimidation. They talked about property damage if they refuse." Thomas leaned back, rubbing his weary eyes. "Black Creek is a hostile territory, Elias. The sheriff is their man. I can't just ride in there on the word of one man, even with this evidence. I need to mobilize a detachment, secure a warrant, based on the suspicion of fraud and coercion. That takes hours, sometimes a full day." Elias felt a crushing despair. A day is too late. They'll sign the papers, and the Williamses will be trapped forever. Thomas saw the desperation and the clear-eyed, realistic assessment of the situation in Elias's eyes. The psychological weight of the injustice was too palpable to dismiss. "We'll leave at first light, but we need to move faster. I'll secure the warrant tonight, based on probable cause of conspiracy to violate the Civil Rights Act. You will guide us, Elias. You know the back roads. But if we are challenged, you step back. You are a witness, not an officer of the law. Is that clear?" "Clear," Elias agreed, the word a promise. The ticking clock was still running, but Elias had finally found the necessary help. The journey back would be even more fraught with tension, a race against time, with the future of an entire community hanging in the balance. Elias and Agent Thomas, accompanied by 2 hardened federal marshals, rode out of Atlanta well before dawn. The air was cold and damp, a stark contrast to the sweltering heat of Black Creek, reflecting the grim, serious mood of the riders. Agent Thomas, now clad in a heavy trench coat and carrying a repeating rifle, rode beside Elias. "We're operating on a highly volatile legal footing, Elias," Thomas warned, his voice low and serious. "The warrant is for conspiracy to defraud and coercion. It gives us authority, but the sheriff will fight us every step of the way, claiming states' rights. We need to be fast and non-confrontational until we have physical evidence, the signed contracts, or the victim's testimony. The psychological pressure on Elias was immense. He was leading men into a tense, hostile environment, and the consequences of failure were devastating. He had to suppress the years of personal rage against Caldwell and function purely as a guide and witness. They pushed the horses relentlessly, following Elias's precise, intimate knowledge of the Georgia backroads. He guided them through overgrown logging trails and shallow river crossings, avoiding the main roads where they might be spotted by one of Caldwell's lookouts. Around mid-morning, as the sun broke through the thick canopy of trees, Elias spotted a telltale sign. A single rider, moving fast toward Black Creek from the direction of a nearby town. "Look out," Elias murmured, pulling his horse to a sudden halt. "They're signaling. Caldwell knows something is up, or he's just maintaining vigilance." Thomas nodded, pulling a pair of field glasses from his saddlebag. "He's running a tight ship. We need to skirt the town entirely. Where is the Williams farm in relation to the main road and the lodge?" Elias pointed toward a thick cluster of woods. "It's off the old Henderson path. We can reach it by cutting through Oak Haven's eastern field, the one that hasn't been cultivated since the war. It's rough, but it will put us right on their doorstep without going near the inn or the sheriff's office." The final leg of the journey was the worst. The terrain was unforgiving, tangled roots, broken fences, and dense thickets. The psychological terror of the timed race was almost unbearable. Elias imagined Caldwell smiling, placing the pen in the hand of the desperate Mr. Williams, forcing him to sign away his future. As they emerged from the woods, the Williams farm came into view. It was a small, well-kept cabin, surrounded by a few acres of healthy crops. And standing on the porch, dominating the scene, were three figures: Colonel Caldwell, Jed, and a third man, the nervous Silas Jr. They were not yet inside. The Williams family was clearly visible on the porch: Mr. Williams, his wife Elara, and two children clinging to her skirt. Elias's breath caught in his throat. He saw the tension in Mr. Williams's posture, a man backed into a corner, trying to maintain dignity in the face of absolute power. Caldwell held a stack of papers, clearly the agreement for indentured labor. They were too late for a peaceful intervention. "They're starting now," Elias whispered, the rage threatening to break through his careful control. Agent Thomas, surprisingly calm, held up a hand. "Wait. We need to be strategic. The marshals and I will approach the house from the front, in the open. You, Elias, circle wide. We need a distraction. Something to draw Jed's attention for a few minutes while we approach. We cannot afford an outright firefight." "A distraction?" Elias questioned. "They'll shoot at anything that moves in the field." "Make it good," Thomas urged. "But don't engage. The marshals are federal. They won't shoot at a warning shot. They'll shoot to protect their own." Elias understood. He was the local element of chaos that would buy the federal agents the few crucial minutes they needed to get close enough to assert their authority. Without a word, Elias broke away, riding Bessie into the long, dense grass of the uncultivated field. He rode not toward the house, but toward the dilapidated barn, a large, tinder-dry wooden structure about 50 yards from the cabin. He dismounted quickly, pulling out his knife. He ran to the side of the barn, found the dried, brittle straw stacked high against the wall, and used his knife to carve a bundle of kindling. The suspense was agonizing, knowing that Caldwell could see the smallest movement. He struck a match, the tiny, sputtering flame a symbol of the desperate gamble. As a thin ribbon of smoke began to curl into the sky, Elias let out a sharp, guttural yell, not a cry of aggression, but a sound designed to startle and confuse. The immediate effect was explosive. Jed immediately turned, pulling a pistol. "There's someone over by the barn. Colonel, it's that black boy." Caldwell cursed, his attention ripped from the papers. "Idiots! Go see what he's doing. Don't let him burn the damned place down." Jed and Silas Jr. started running toward the barn. That was the window. Elias, seeing the marshals move, sprinted away from the smoke, dodging behind the dense hedgerow that lined the field. He saw Agent Thomas and the two marshals, clearly identified by their long coats and federal badges, stride quickly toward the porch. "Colonel Caldwell," Thomas shouted, his voice ringing with authority. "Federal agents, we have a warrant to seize documents related to fraudulent labor practices." Caldwell, caught off guard, froze, the papers clutched in his hand. The surprise was complete. The psychological tension of the standoff was electrifying. Jed and Silas Jr., as seeing the federal marshals, stopped dead, their pistols raised but hesitant. Elias watched from the thicket, his heart pounding, the scent of wood smoke acrid in his nostrils. The hunt had reached its climax, not with a blade, but with the cold, hard reality of the law. The scene at the Williams farm solidified into a tense, dangerous tableau. Colonel Caldwell stood his ground on the porch, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. Jed and Silas Jr., distracted by Elias's deception, remained in the middle of the field, their pistols still raised, torn between the order to capture Elias and the immediate threat of the federal marshals. Agent Thomas, backed by the two stoic marshals, stood at the foot of the porch, his hand resting conspicuously on the butt of his sidearm. "You have no jurisdiction here, Agent Thomas," Caldwell roared, his voice thick with a mixture of fury and shock. "This is a private negotiation between a debtor and his creditor. Get off my property." "It ceased being private when the state of Georgia granted me a warrant, Colonel," Thomas retorted calmly, holding up the official document. "We are seizing those papers and taking your men into custody for questioning regarding a conspiracy to violate the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Place the documents on the railing, Colonel, and step away from the premises." Caldwell, his eyes blazing, tightened his grip on the stack of contracts. He knew that once the federal government got its hands on those carefully worded agreements, his entire scheme of economic re-enslavement would unravel, and with it, his power. Meanwhile, in the field, Elias was watching Jed. Jed was an impulsive, cruel man, and the sight of the federal men gave him a look of cornered desperation. Elias knew Jed was the weakest link and the most likely to break the standoff with violence. "Jed, Silas, shoot the boy," Caldwell yelled, his command breaking the tense silence. "He's trespassing. Shoot him. The federal agents have nothing on me yet." Jed, desperate to regain the colonel's favor and act on his ingrained prejudice, turned his focus back to the hedgerow where Elias was hiding. He took a few purposeful steps and fired a wild warning shot into the thicket, the roar of the pistol deafening in the morning air. Elias instinctively ducked lower, splinters of wood flying past his head. The immediate danger was real, a stark reminder that this was not a legal exercise but a brutal power struggle. The gunshot, however, served as the catalyst Agent Thomas needed. "Marshals, detain Caldwell now. Armed resistance," Thomas commanded, drawing his own pistol. The two marshals moved with professional speed. One rushed up the steps, tackling the surprised colonel before he could retreat into the cabin or use the papers as leverage. The other marshal provided cover, his rifle raised. Caldwell, a man used to absolute control, thrashed and screamed obscenities as he was violently subdued and cuffed. The documents fluttered to the porch floor. Seeing their leader apprehended, Jed and Silas Jr. finally broke. They turned and fled into the open field, running toward the woods on the opposite side, the pistol uselessly dangling in Jed's hand. "Marshals, focus on securing the evidence and Caldwell," Thomas yelled, kneeling to secure the contracts. He looked directly at Elias's position. "Elias, I need you to stay put and be ready to identify Jed and Silas Jr. for the warrant." Elias, heart still pounding from the near miss, remained hidden, watching the chaos unfold. The confrontation had been swift, brutal, and successful, but the core of Caldwell's operation, the network of intimidation and the men who enforced it, were now running free. Thomas secured the papers, bundling them together and tucking them safely inside his coat. He then turned to Mr. and Mrs. Williams, who were standing petrified but unharmed. "Mr. Williams, Mrs. Williams," Thomas said, his voice softer now. These papers are null and void. The colonel is under federal arrest. You are free. We will be taking Caldwell and the papers back to Atlanta immediately for processing." Mr. Williams, a proud man struggling to hold back tears, simply nodded, his relief palpable. As the marshals dragged the struggling Caldwell off the porch, Elias emerged from the thicket, walking toward Agent Thomas. He kept a wary eye on the woods where Jed and Silas Jr. had disappeared. "They're gone, Agent," Elias stated, his gaze fixed on the dense tree line. "Jed is the most dangerous. He won't stop. He lives for Caldwell's approval." Thomas looked at the retreating woods, a line of grim determination setting his jaw. "They're fugitives now. They'll be charged with accessory and attempted assault on a federal witness. That's you, Elias. But we can't chase them right now. The priority is securing the evidence and the colonel. If we lose the papers, we lose the case." Elias looked at Caldwell, now struggling inside the marshal's carriage. The look of pure, unadulterated hatred in the colonel's eyes as he stared back at Elias, the man he had branded, the man who had brought his kingdom crashing down, was a moment of chilling psychological triumph, but also profound, terrifying danger. The colonel knew his name, and his revenge would now be absolute, even from behind bars. Elias had achieved his goal. The conspiracy was dismantled, his community was safe, and Caldwell was captured. But the hunt was not over. The true terror had just begun, for the two most volatile of Caldwell's men were now loose, knowing Elias was the reason for their collapse. The pursuit had shifted from Elias hunting the colonel to Jed and Silas Jr. hunting Elias. With Colonel Caldwell and the crucial documents secured, Agent Thomas and the marshals made a hasty departure for Atlanta. The silence they left behind at the Williams farm was heavier than the humid air, charged with residual fear and a tentative, fragile relief. Elias, refusing a ride, took the long, cautious route back to his own cabin. His initial feeling of psychological release, the sweet, cold taste of justice, was quickly replaced by a sharp, paralyzing dread. He had not just brought down Caldwell, he had also exposed himself as the informant. The enemy, the one who broke the unspoken rules of Black Creek. He was now a target, and the hunters, Jed and Silas Jr., were intimate with the local terrain, as vicious as cornered animals, and fueled by the colonel's vengeance. When Elias arrived home, Sarah was waiting, sitting by the closed shutters, her face lined with exhaustion and anxiety. She had done her part, sending the Reverend John to warn the Williams family to be cautious and prepared. "Caldwell is caught, Mama," Elias announced, collapsing onto a stool. "The papers are seized. The Williamses are safe." Sarah nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. "I heard the marshals ride out, but I also heard about the shooting. Jed and that other one. They saw you, Elias. They know." The truth hung between them, undeniable and terrifying. Elias was trapped. He couldn't leave Black Creek and abandon his home, and he couldn't stay without facing an imminent deadly threat. "We have to leave," Sarah stated, her voice trembling but firm, "just for a time. Until the trial in Atlanta forces them to accept it's over. We can go to your uncle in Macon." "No," Elias said, his stubbornness rooted in the memory of the brand. "This is my home. If I run, they win. They will know I can be broken. If I leave, they will burn the cabin, and when I come back, they'll be waiting. They have to know I won't back down." His refusal to flee was a psychological necessity, a stand against the fear that had governed his life since the day of the branding. But it was also a tactical mistake. He spent the rest of the day fortifying their small cabin. He hammered extra planks across the windows, barricaded the door with heavy furniture, and sharpened his knife again. The metallic scent of the steel a thin comfort. He moved silently, his movements betraying the hypervigilance of a hunted man. As the sun set, the quiet of the woods became an oppressive force. Elias and Sarah sat in the dimly lit cabin, listening to the night. Every creak of the wood, every hoot of an owl, was amplified into a threat. Around midnight, a noise shattered the tension, Not a loud crash, but a deliberate, chilling sound. Scraping. It came from the side of the cabin, the sound of a sharp object being dragged slowly and forcefully across the weathered wood. Elias froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. He held his breath, straining to locate the source. The scraping sound moved slowly, deliberately, around the corner toward the front of the cabin, passing the single small window. It stopped directly at the front door. A moment of agonizing silence passed. Then, Elias heard a voice, a low, venomous whisper right outside the door. It was Jed. "We know you're in there, Elias. We know you're the snake that broke the Colonel's house. You think the Yankees can protect you? They're already back in Atlanta, and we're still here." Another pause, and then the scraping resumed. Louder this time. Elias crept to the front door, peering through a knothole in the wood. He could see nothing but the heavy, moonless night. "We're not going to kill you, Elias," Jed's voice hissed, a low, terrifying sound of pure, psychopathic malice. "That's too easy. The Colonel wants you to know that the brand on your back isn't just a scar. It's a promise. We'll wait." The scraping sound stopped abruptly, replaced by the heavy thud of an object being dropped on the porch. Then, silence. The complete, terrifying silence of men who have achieved their psychological objective and retreated into the darkness. Elias waited, knife ready, until the first pale hint of dawn touched the sky. When he finally opened the door, what he saw was simple, yet devastating. The object dropped on the porch was a small, crudely carved wooden doll, a miniature representation of a man. Pinned to its chest was a large, freshly picked black feather, and scratched deeply into the wood of his front door, right at eye level, was a large, crude and perfectly rendered capital C, the unmistakable symbol of Colonel Caldwell's brand. The message was clear. They were watching, they were waiting, and the terror had only just begun. The hunt was now a siege. If you've made it this far, you're clearly addicted to the suspense. The noose is tightening around Elias, and his resolve is being tested like never before. Don't risk missing the terrifying next chapters and the final shocking resolution. Hit the subscribe button and ring that notification bell right now. Your support helps us keep telling these dark, realistic stories. The sight of the newly carved C on his door was a profound act of psychological terrorism. It was a clear, physical manifestation of the invisible enemy, a deliberate, personalized invasion of his sanctuary. Elias spent the morning methodically sanding and patching the door, trying to erase the mark, but the effort felt futile. The brand was now etched into his mind. The immediate crisis was the isolation. Caldwell's men had achieved their goal. They had terrified Elias into confinement, and by extension, separated him from the fragile support network of Black Creek. No one would risk approaching the cabin now, fearing Jed's quick, violent temper. Elias knew he needed to regain the initiative, but Sarah's fear was mounting. She was a woman who had endured a lifetime of oppression, and this new personal threat was pushing her to the breaking point. "We have to go to Macon, Elias," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "Jed is not Caldwell. He won't just use fear. He'll burn us out." "We need a plan, Mama," Elias replied, trying to keep his own rising terror in check. "They are playing a waiting game. They expect me to crack, to run, or to confront them in the open where they can ambush me. I need to find out where they are hiding." He turned his focus back to the only person he could trust, Reverend John. He had to re-establish communication. He devised a plan that relied on observation and the simple, overlooked routines of the rural South. Under the guise of the afternoon heat, Elias watched the surrounding fields through the tiny gaps in the window planks. He noticed a pattern, a specific dirt road, seldom used, that led past the cabin and eventually connected to the main path toward the Reverend's small farm. That night, Elias prepared. He took a bottle of Sarah's potent, home-brewed elderberry wine, something she occasionally sold to the Reverend for medicinal purposes, and a short, carefully worded note. Under the cover of a dense, low-hanging fog that rolled in from the nearby swamp, a meteorological phenomenon that was both a blessing and a curse, Elias crept out of the cabin. He left Sarah barricaded inside, assuring her he would be back before dawn. He moved low and fast, navigating by instinct. He reached the dirt road and placed the bottle and the note near a familiar stump, a landmark he knew the Reverend would recognize on his usual route to the church. He then retreated to the thicket of tall pines, planning to wait until he saw the Reverend collect the package. The hours that followed were a torturous exercise in suspense. The fog was so thick it distorted sound and shape, turning every tree into a lurking figure, every snapping branch into a stalker. This sensory deprivation was the perfect setting for psychological terror. Elias felt exposed, a small, fragile life in a vast, malevolent landscape. Just as the sky began to lighten with the first hint of morning, a figure emerged from the fog. It was Reverend John, walking slowly, his shoulders slumped with weariness. He was not on his way to the church, but returning from a worried trip into town, having heard the whispers about the previous day's confrontation. The Reverend paused at the stump, his eyes trained on the ground. He spotted the bottle of wine and the small rolled note. He quickly scooped them up, his movements betraying a practiced stealth. Elias emerged cautiously from the thicket, keeping his voice low. "Reverend, it's Elias." Reverend John spun around, startled, but quickly recovered. "Elias, thank God. I feared the worst when the sheriff's boy came around asking about you. They're watching, Reverend, Jed and Silas Jr. They marked my door. I need to know where they are hiding. They can't be staying in town. Caldwell's capture has made them too visible." The Reverend lowered his voice, his eyes darting into the fog. "They're not in town, but they're not far. I heard a rumor from one of my flock, a stable boy at the inn. Jed and Silas Jr. are holed up in the old Caldwell hunting cabin on the North Ridge. It's remote, and no one dares go near it. They're waiting for night to move. The Caldwell hunting cabin, a structure steeped in years of the Colonel's brutal history. It was the perfect lair for his desperate enforcers. Elias now had their location, a significant step in regaining control. "Thank you, Reverend," Elias said, the relief a physical wave. "I need you to send a message to Agent Thomas in Atlanta. Tell him that Jed and Silas Jr. are hiding at the hunting cabin on the North Ridge, plotting an attack on me, the federal witness. He needs to send someone back." "I will," the Reverend promised, gripping Elias's shoulder, "but you must be careful. If they think the law is coming for them again, they'll act out of sheer madness." Elias retreated back into the fog, moving with renewed purpose. He had bought himself time and a means of escape. The marshals were coming, but they wouldn't arrive for at least another day. Elias looked at the sun finally rising over the ridge, illuminating the heavy fog. He had a 24-hour window where the hunters were exposed, and he was still trapped. The terror was not over, but the tables had been subtly turned. Elias now had the knowledge of the enemy's hiding place, and that knowledge was power. He could now choose his battlefield. Elias returned to the cabin, the sun now high and unforgiving. The knowledge of Jed and Silas Jr., his location, the Caldwell hunting cabin, was a heavy weight, forcing him into a strategic decision. He had sent for help, but help was a day away. He was not a patient man, especially with his mother's psychological well-being deteriorating under the constant threat. "We can't wait here, Mama," Elias stated, his voice firm, packing a small bag with water and supplies. "They are waiting for nightfall. They will assume I'm alone, waiting to run. I have to make them think I have run. It will draw them out, or at least shift their focus." Sarah looked at him, her eyes wide with fear. "Elias, what are you planning?" "I'm moving the battlefield. If they are waiting for me to run, I'll run right at them. I'm going to the hunting cabin, not to fight them, but to use the surroundings. I know those woods better than they do." The plan was highly dangerous, rooted in a psychological maneuver. Elias would leave a trail, a dropped item, a scuff mark, leading away from the cabin toward the North Ridge, but not directly to the hunting cabin. He needed to make them believe he was fleeing, then ambush them by utilizing the terrain's complexities. Elias embraced his mother. "I need you to stay here, Mama. Stay quiet. The marshals will arrive sometime tomorrow. When they do, you tell them I went toward the North Ridge, but do not tell them about the cabin. Tell them I'm trying to draw the men away." He set off late that afternoon, using a winding, roundabout route to the ridge. He made deliberate, subtle mistakes. A broken branch, a discarded water canteen near a known path. He was luring the wolf from its den. As the dusk settled, Elias reached the perimeter of the hunting cabin. It was a rustic, solid log structure, surrounded by thick pine and a few large, ancient boulders. A thin spiral of smoke rose from the chimney, confirming the Reverend's intelligence. He concealed himself behind a massive granite outcropping, the perfect vantage point. He settled in, his knife ready, his senses acutely tuned to the sounds of the forest. The only movement inside the cabin was the occasional shadow passing the single, grimy window. The plan required a psychological move to draw them out. He took a heavy stone and threw it hard against the back wall of the cabin, then melted back into the dense shadows. The reaction was immediate. The cabin door burst open, and Jed and Silas Jr. emerged, their faces grim, weapons drawn. They were not expecting a confrontation, but a quiet, nocturnal escape. "What was that?" Jed hissed, his voice raw with tension. "The wind, maybe." Silas Jr. stammered, clearly terrified. "No, that was a rock," Jed asserted, his eyes scanning the perimeter. "He's here. That snake is trying to burn us out." Elias had achieved his goal. They were outside, exposed and paranoid. He didn't want to engage them now, but to wait for them to make a move that exposed their full intent. Suddenly, Jed's eyes fixed on a small, broken twig Elias had accidentally stepped on near the boulder. It was too small for Silas Jr. to notice, but not for the seasoned hunter in Jed. "He's behind the rocks," Jed yelled, pointing his pistol. "He's been here the whole time. We'll circle him. Silas, go around the back. I'll take the front. We flush him out." The siege had become a deadly, close-quarters hunt. Elias's plan had worked too well, trapping him between the two men. Silas Jr. circled cautiously around the left, while Jed moved toward the right, using the boulders for cover. Elias was now fully engaged in the fight. The only way out was forward. He was not looking for a fatal confrontation, but a definitive, visible act of self-defense that would solidify his status as a protected witness when the marshals arrived. As Silas Jr. came around the boulder, his eyes wide and panicked, Elias made his move. He didn't strike to kill, but to neutralize. He lunged out from the shadow, hitting Silas Jr. with a devastating low tackle that sent the man sprawling. Silas Jr.'s pistol skittered across the stones. The sound of the struggle alerted Jed. "Silas, what's happening?" Elias, utilizing the element of surprise, pinned Silas Jr. down, his forearm pressed against the man's throat. Silas Jr. struggled, choking, his face contorted in terror. "Jed, it's me, Elias," Elias yelled, his voice carrying clearly through the pines. "I know Caldwell's orders. You can stop this now. The marshals are coming at dawn. They will see this as self-defense." Jed, a man of pure animalistic loyalty to Caldwell, was consumed by rage. He emerged from the shadows, pistol aimed directly at Elias. "You're a liar," Jed screamed, his voice breaking. "You're a dead man. The colonel promised us." He fired. Elias instinctively rolled to the side, releasing the struggling Silas Jr. The bullet hit the granite boulder where Elias had just been, sending a spray of white-hot stone shards into the air. Elias scrambled back toward the deepest shadows, his blood pumping a frantic rhythm. He saw his opening, the small path leading away from the cabin, choked with thick undergrowth. If he could get into the open forest, the marshals would find him easily by morning. He ran, the shouts of the two men echoing behind him. Jed, now consumed by blind fury, was chasing him, firing wildly into the night. The chase was desperate, a final terrifying race for survival that would determine who was truly trapped. Elias plunged into the absolute darkness of the woods, Jed's angry, uncoordinated shots echoing behind him. Silas Jr., shaken and disarmed, was yelling, trying to coordinate a pursuit he was too terrified to join. Elias was running on pure adrenaline and the desperate knowledge that he could not afford to be caught. He ran toward the small, nearly dry creek bed he knew separated the hunting cabin's property from the main road. The creek bed was a maze of thick roots and sudden drops, impossible to navigate at speed without knowing the terrain. Elias knew the terrain intimately. His childhood had been spent exploring these very woods to escape the drudgery of the plantation. Jed, driven by a raw personal hatred for Elias, the living embodiment of his world crumbling, was close behind, stumbling and cursing. Elias reached the creek bed and plunged down the embankment, his boots finding familiar purchase on a series of thick, knotted roots. He crossed the narrow, muddy bottom and started scrambling up the opposite side, the sound of Jed crashing into the embankment he had just left. "I've got you, you damned field hand!" Jed roared, blinded by the darkness and his own rage. Jed, not knowing the creek bed's treacherous layout, slipped on the slick mud and fell hard. The impact was immediately followed by a sharp, terrible crack, the sound of his pistol discharging uselessly into the dirt. Elias paused on the opposite bank, his heart hammering, listening. Jed wasn't shouting anymore. He was making a low, guttural noise of pain. Elias, realizing the immediate danger had passed, crept back to the edge of the embankment and peered down. Jed was on the ground, his leg twisted beneath him at an unnatural angle, clearly broken. His pistol lay several feet away, uselessly mired in the mud. He was not a threat, but a helpless, whimpering man. A wave of intense, blinding rage. The accumulation of 23 years of oppression, the memory of the brand, the sight of his mother's fear, washed over Elias. He had the advantage. He had the knife. The years of psychological torment, the trauma of the branding, cried out for a swift, final vengeance. Elias descended the bank slowly, his knife held low. He stood over the injured man, the moonlight now finally piercing the canopy, casting a sharp silver gleam on the blade. Jed looked up, his face slick with sweat and pain, recognizing the absolute terrifying finality of the moment. The hunter had become the hunted. "Elias, don't," he gasped, his voice thin and pathetic. Elias looked at the man who had gladly served the colonel, who had gleefully participated in the terror, who had just tried to shoot him in cold blood. The brand on his back burned with an imagined heat. This was the moment of his release, the payment for his suffering. But then, the face of his mother, Sarah, flashed in his mind. Her warning. "Vengeance. It's a cold path. It won't bring back what we lost. It'll only lose you." Elias stopped. His hand, gripping the knife, trembled. He was not a killer. He was a survivor seeking justice. Killing Jed in the darkness would make him no better than the men who had ruled Black Creek with violence and fear. It would erase the moral high ground he had fought so hard to secure with Agent Thomas. He lowered the knife, his breathing ragged. The hunt was for justice, not murder. "You're not worth it, Jed," Elias said, his voice a low, heavy rasp. "You are just a footnote to the colonel's downfall." He turned and shouted toward the direction of the cabin. "Silas, your friend is injured. He won't be bothering anyone. If you want to live, you stay here. The federal agents are coming for you both in a few hours." Elias quickly retreated, leaving the injured man and the terrified Silas Jr. to face the coming morning and the law. He ran until he reached the relative safety of the main road, then waited. As the sun began to rise, bathing the forest in a warm, golden light, Elias heard the distant, familiar sound of horses. It was Agent Thomas and the marshals. He stepped out of the woods, raising his hands, his face streaked with mud and exhaustion. "Elias!" Thomas dismounted quickly, relief evident on his face. "We heard shots. What happened?" Elias explained the ambush, the chase, and the fate of Jed and Silas Jr., careful to emphasize the self-defense and the neutralizing of the threat, leaving out the final psychological confrontation. Guided by Elias, the marshals found the injured Jed and the whimpering Silas Jr. huddled near the creek bed, waiting for capture. The evidence, 2 men, fugitives caught while hunting a federal witness, was undeniable. Elias returned to the cabin a hero to his mother, his community, and the law. Sarah met him at the door, embracing him tightly. She saw the exhaustion, but also a new, profound peace in his eyes. Colonel Caldwell's conspiracy was over. The trial, 6 months later in Atlanta, was swift. The contracts were declared illegal. Caldwell was sentenced to a long term for fraud, coercion, and conspiracy, and Jed and Silas Jr. were convicted of lesser but serious crimes. Elias never looked at the brand on his back again as a mark of shame or a sign of terror. It was a scar, a reminder not of the man who inflicted it, but of the man who survived it, who fought for his community, and who chose justice over vengeance. The psychological terror of the past was finally laid to rest, replaced by the quiet, hard-won peace of a free man in a new, uncertain world.